joining us now from the Capitol is Representative Elijah Cummings, Democrat of Maryland. And here with us in New York is MSNBC contributor Jonathan Capehart of The Washington Post and MSNBC contributor Jimmy Williams. Congressman, if I might start with you, as our correspondent Pete Williams just made clear, the Voting Rights Act may be one of the best laws in this nation's history, but it had a very rough ride at the Supreme Court today. In fact, Justice Scalia, in a statement that reportedly provoked gasps from those inside the Supreme Court, said that the law is, and I'm quoting him, a perpetuation of racial entitlement. Sir, what on earth does he mean by that?
I can tell you, it just reminds me of some of the things that Governor Romney was saying during the campaign. Clearly, it's not any kind of racial entitlement. Our Constitution says that everybody has a right to vote and that those votes should be counted, and I believe that very strongly. And the Voting Rights Act was put in force because there were so many people being discriminated against. And so I disagree with him wholeheartedly. And then there was something else that was said by one of the conservative justices, and they said that they didn't believe that the Congress should are in a position to decide the question regarding Section 5. That's quite insulting. We do have three branches of government, and I think we can decide quite well. And keep in mind, Martin, we just reauthorized the Voting Rights Act back in 2006, 98-0 in the Senate and 300 and something to 33 in the House. And that was just in 2006. The question is, what's happened since 2006? And I would submit that we need to look at what happened in 2008, the election of Barack Obama.
Jonathan, the congressman raises that as an issue, 2008. But isn't it the case that in 2012, what we've just been through is plentiful evidence of people trying to suppress the vote, whether in Alaska, Texas, North Carolina, Ohio, Florida, Pennsylvania? I mean, how many times did that happen?
It happened a lot, and it happened so much that people in 2012 were thinking, wait a minute, what year are we in? We hadn't seen that kind of effort to suppress the vote in a very long time. The idea, now look, it's a good thing that the justices are asking tough questions, the right questions. Andrea Mitchell earlier in the afternoon did an interview with Sherilyn Ifill of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and she said, you know, the liberal justices on the court also asked very tough questions of the Solicitor General, who's arguing on behalf of the government against the Shelby defendants, if you will. And so, as Pete said, we can't read too much into the conservative justices' questions. But when you have Antonin Scalia talking about racial entitlement, that should send a shiver through a lot of people's spines about what could possibly happen.
Jimmy, isn't this an attempt to institutionalize the form of gerrymandering that Section 5 in effect prevents from happening? Because we've already seen gerrymandering of congressional districts, and John and I have talked many times about that. But if this were allowed to happen, if this Voting Rights Act was struck down, this would give a kind of institutional flavor to the possibility of suppressing the vote wherever you like.
If Section 5 or the entire Voting Rights Act were to be struck down, then what that for all intents and purposes says is the state legislatures can then go in and they can change their state election laws.
No reference to the federal government.
Absolutely. The federal government under a Republican or a Democrat would have virtually no say in what those districts like. No more minority districts in the country. They could go in and rewrite those in the next round of redistricting or before. We've seen that they've done this. So this theory that the country, which by the way is not as white as it used to be and is not as segregated as it used to be, will all of a sudden become remarkably segregated once again. That is a scary thing. The GOP needs to rethink this theory of having a big tent. If the court strikes this down, and then all of a sudden they have this idea of these districts that are just going to bleed out into white districts all over the country, the representation, and they want women to vote for them, and African Americans to vote for them, and Latinos to vote for them, there'll be no representation in Congress for this.
Congressman, to Jimmy's point, we've just had an election where 74% of Hispanics voted for the current president, 94% of African Americans voted for the current president. It's hard for us not to look at this discussion at the moment and assume that the mantra is, if you can't beat them, cheat them. Cheat them out of their electoral rights, disenfranchise them, and that's the way Republicans can win.
Yeah, well, I think there's little question about that. When we look at this past election, of course, Martin, you know, my committee, Oversight and Government Reform, has been looking into this whole voting situation, looking at True to Vote, where True to Vote was basically going around challenging registered voters, legitimately registered voters, and at the same time challenging people at the polls. And we saw, of course, the efforts at getting rid of early voting or reducing it substantially. And in many instances, folks saying that that was their intention. That is, legislators saying it was their intention to make sure that African Americans or Hispanics did not vote. Clearly, if there was a time for the Voting Rights Act, and if there was a time for Section 5, it is now.
Right now.
If it were not in place, we would have to create it.
Absolutely. What happens if Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is knocked down? Does it go back to the Congress? And what happens when it's considered by the Congress? When
they passed the 15th Amendment, it gave Congress a huge amount of latitude, if you will, to do whatever they needed to do congressionally, legislatively, under that amendment to the Constitution. If the court strikes down Section 5 and even worse, Section 2, which applies to the entire country, right, then the Congress would have to go back in and would have to rewrite, essentially, a brand new Voting Rights Act. And if that's the case, you have a Democratic Senate, not with a filibuster, without a filibuster-proof majority. Right. You have a Republican-led House. Again, I go back to what I said before. A Congress under Republicans in the House and barely by Democrats in the Senate would have to rewrite the Voting Rights Act. I would suggest to you it looks starkly different than it did in 1965.
Would you agree with that, John?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's starkly different and not better.
Not better at all.
Not better at all.
Yeah. Jimmy Williams, Jonathan Capehart, and Congressman Elijah Cummings. Mr. Cummings, I know you rushed out from a vote, so thank you, sir, so much for coming to join us. Thank you, sir. Next, a Republican